Julia Carter's morning began with the kind of minor mishaps that one laughs over later with friends. First, her alarm failed to rouse her from sleep, leading to a hurried scramble out of bed. Her foot found a cold puddle of coffee on the floor beside her desk, a result of her cat, Picasso, knocking over her mug. An omen she'd dismiss with a quick, frustrated wipe and a mental note to buy a travel mug. As she rushed to salvage what remained of the morning, her attempts were thwarted by her laptop refusing to wake from its own slumber. A silent plea to the tech gods went unanswered, leaving her with no choice but to tote the unresponsive device across campus to the IT department, her sketches for a new environmental design project clutched in her other hand. In her Design Fundamentals lecture, as the professor waxed poetic about the intricate details of Parisian architecture, Julia's mind wandered. The City of Light had always been the pinnacle of her dreams, a place she longed to explore, to soak in the art and history, to sketch in the shadow of the Eiffel Tower. Yet today the images projected on the screen seemed distant, as if the Paris in her mind was obscured by a sudden fog. The rest of the day passed in a haze, her interactions mechanical, her responses delayed. Emily, her roommate and confidant since freshman year, noticed the pallor of her skin and the shadows beneath her eyes. "You look like you've seen a ghost," Emily remarked as they walked from the lecture hall, her concern veiling the campus's autumn crispness. "It's nothing," Julia lied, the weight of the morning's discovery pressing on her chest like a physical burden. But Emily was not convinced, and by the end of their impromptu study session, she had persuaded Julia to visit the pharmacy. The purchase they made there, a pregnancy test, was tucked away in Julia's bag, a secret wrapped in plastic and cardboard. Night fell with a reluctance that matched Julia's own as she sat on the edge of her bed, the pregnancy test instructions spread out before her. Picasso purred beside her, a comforting presence against the storm of anxiety brewing in her heart. The mural of Paris, on her dorm wall, once a beacon of inspiration, now watched over her like a distant dream, a reminder of a future that felt suddenly uncertain. The two pink lines appeared quickly, decisively, as if they had been waiting just beneath the surface all along. Julia Carter stared at them, her dreams of Paris, of art, of freedom, clashing with the new life the test confirmed. The room felt smaller, the walls closer, her breaths shorter. A single thought crystallized amidst the chaos in her mind. What now? The sun filtered through the blinds, casting a lattice of light and shadow across Julia Carter's desk. The pregnancy test from the night before lay hidden in her drawer, like a secret too heavy to carry into the daylight. She sat on her bed, cradling her head in her hands, the drumming of her heartbeat loud in the silence of the morning. Julia Carter shuffled to class, the weight of her secret bending her normally erect posture. In the art history lecture, her professor unveiled a series of Renaissance paintings, each depicting the Madonna and Child. The tender scenes, once mere historical images to Julia Carter, now seemed to pierce through her, each brushstroke a sharp reminder of her predicament. Later, in the crowded buzz of the campus cafe, Aaron, her boyfriend, reached across the table, covering her hand with his. He was saying all the right things, but his eyes darted away too often, his voice a pitch too high. It became clear. Aaron was supportive in theory, but the practicalities of parenthood, the permanence of it, scared him just as much as they did her. After their conversation, Julia Carter watched from the cafe window as a young family played in the park across the street. The carefree laughter of the children, the gentle guidance of the parents, it all seemed like scenes from a movie she'd never star in. She pulled her sketchbook from her bag, her hand moving of its own accord, lines and curves flowing onto the page. But instead of the usual abstract designs and bold patterns, she found herself drawing a cradle, the strokes tentative and uncertain. That night, Julia Carter's dorm room was dark, save for the blue glow of her laptop screen. She scrolled through page after page of information on adoption, her eyes scanning stories of couples yearning for a child, to complete their family. Each click was a step further into an unknown world, a step away from the life she had planned. With a heavy sigh, she closed her laptop, the glow fading, leaving her alone with the shadows and her thoughts. The night was quiet as she lay in bed, the silence a canvas for her fears and hopes. Paris seemed a world away, a dream adrift on a sea of new and daunting responsibilities. She knew that the choices she made now, in the coming days, would shape not just her life, but the life of the child she carried. With a resolve that surprised her, Julia Carter whispered into the darkness, a promise to the life inside her. "I will find the best path for us both." Julia Carter's footsteps echoed through the nearly empty campus quad as she made her way to the Student Health Centre. The protest that had erupted there just days before, a fervent clash between student groups over the rights and roles of student mothers, now felt like a personal affront. She tightened her grip on the strap of her bag, a physical attempt to hold herself together. Inside the health centre, Julia Carter was met with warm smiles and pamphlets on parenting and adoption, each one seeming to echo her parents' hopes for her future. The nurse's kind words were a balm, but they couldn't soothe the turmoil that churned inside her. As she left, a flyer on the community board caught her eye, a support group for student parents. She tore it off the wall, the paper's edge jagged in her hurried determination. Back in her dorm, Julia Carter sat at her desk, her design project laid out before her. The assignment was to create a visual representation of the future, a concept that now felt ironic. Her designs were usually vibrant and full of movement, but today her sketches were introspective, the lines weaving a story of their own, a tree with roots running deep and branches reaching out, like the life she carried branching into her own. In the evening, Julia Carter found herself in the campus art studio, her hands moulding clay in an art therapy session she'd joined on a whim. The clay was cool and yielding beneath her fingers, a welcome distraction from the rigidity of her thoughts. Beside her, a woman named Grace, whose demeanour spoke of battles fought and won, shared her story of being a mother and a student. Julia Carter felt a kinship with her, a sense of solidarity that had been missing since her journey began. As Julia Carter walked back to her room, the support group flyer folded neatly in her pocket. She felt a glimmer of hope. Perhaps she wasn't as alone as she had thought. Perhaps, in this new world of choices and challenges, there were allies to be found and new paths to forge. The night didn't seem quite so dark anymore, and the tree in her sketches seemed less like a symbol of entrapment and more like one of strength. The student centre was abuzz with activity, the air filled with the chatter of students and the clatter of keyboards. Julia Carter moved through the crowd, her presence drawing a different kind of attention now. Whispers followed her like shadows as she passed, the swell of her belly a beacon for judgmental eyes. She pretended not to notice, but each murmur was a pinprick, each stare a reminder of her reality. In the safe confines of a study room, Julia Carter met with her academic advisor. The room was sterile, the ticking clock a metronome to her growing unease. Her advisor, Ms. Thompson, laid out the academic consequences of Julia's situation with clinical detachment. Julia Carter felt the walls close in as her dreams and her responsibilities seemed to be pitched in battle before her. "Take the semester off," Ms. Thompson suggested, her voice a mixture of pity and pragmatism. "Consider your options." But Julia Carter heard, "Give up," and it steeled her resolve. Later that day, Julia Carter found solace on a secluded bench by the university's rose garden. She sketched the blooms, her lines shaky with emotion. A crumpled note landed on her sketch pad, tossed by a passing stranger. "You're not alone," it read, the handwriting a looping scrawl. Julia Carter clutched the note to her chest, a lifeline thrown in the midst of a storm. It was a simple act of kindness, but it was enough to remind her that, amidst the challenges, there was still warmth and empathy to be found. That evening, Julia Carter laid out her sketches, the roses now intertwined with images of a mother and child. The note lay beside them, its message echoing in the quiet of her room. There was a battle ahead, she knew, a fight for her future and the future of her child. But with each act of kindness, each offer of support, Julia Carter felt her armor thicken, her resolve harden. She wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. She was fighting for the silent heartbeat that accompanied her wherever she went. The university auditorium hummed with anticipation as Julia Carter took the stage for the student-parent forum she had organized. The seats were filled with an eclectic mix of her peers, faculty, and a few curious onlookers. As she began to speak, her voice betrayed a tremor, but her conviction was clear. She laid bare the struggles of student parents, her own plight interwoven with a broader call to action. It was her stand against the tide of stigma and silence. In the crowd, a hand shot up, a sharp voice challenging Julia Carter's right to education amidst her choices. Julia Carter's cheeks flushed with heat, but her response was calm and formidable. She argued for inclusivity and support, her words painting a vision of a campus that upheld the values of diversity and compassion it preached. This confrontation, though harrowing, only served to strengthen Julia Carter's cause in the eyes of many who watched. The forum concluded with applause and a mixture of reactions, but Julia Carter felt a quiet triumph as she exited the stage. Grace was waiting for her, a smile of approval on her lips. They retreated to a quiet cafe, the smell of roasted coffee beans enveloping them. Over steaming cups, they discussed the next steps, strategizing with a newfound fervor. Julia Carter's plans for advocacy took shape, more tangible and urgent than before. Later, as night descended, Julia Carter sat in the soft glow of her desk lamp, penning letters to the university board. Each word was a declaration, each sentence a step toward a future she was determined to forge, not just for herself, but for all student parents. She sealed the envelopes with a sense of purpose, her heart a little lighter, her path a little clearer. The forum was only the beginning, and Julia Carter was ready for the journey ahead. The morning after the forum, Julia Carter woke to a campus still buzzing with the aftermath. As she walked to her first class, she could feel the weight of everyone's gaze. The debate had stirred up more than just policy discussions. It had laid bare the deep divides in the student body. In her digital design class, Julia Carter's focus was interrupted by a text message from an unknown number, revealing the forum had been recorded and was now circulating online. Her private struggle had become a public spectacle. She excused herself from class, a knot forming in her stomach as she stepped out into the hallway to watch the video. Her words were there, but so were the hostile questions, the tense exchanges, her moment of vulnerability on full display. That evening, Julia Carter attended a meeting with the Student Government Association, her hands trembling as she presented her proposal for better resources for student parents. The room was a sea of impassive faces, her words seemingly echoing off the walls without finding purchase. As she spoke, a council member interrupted, their rebuttal sharp and dismissive, questioning the allocation of funds towards a minority issue. The meeting ended with no resolution, leaving Julia Carter feeling as though her cries were lost in the wind. Returning to her dorm, defeated and weary, Julia Carter found an unexpected email waiting for her. It was from Michael and Sarah, the prospective adoptive parents. Their words were a balm to her bruised spirit. They spoke of admiration for her courage, of their understanding of her struggle, and their hopes for the future. In the quiet of her room, surrounded by the remnants of her battle, Julia Carter allowed herself a moment of respite, a moment of connection with two strangers who saw her not as a cause, but as a person. Julia Carter sat alone on the edge of her bed in the dim glow of dawn, the chill of the morning seeping through the window she'd left ajar. The events of the past days loomed over her like a gathering storm cloud. The echoes of the student government meeting rang in her ears, a cacophony of doubt and criticism that drowned out her once resolute voice. She thumbed through a scrapbook of her designs, stopping at a page marked with a blue ribbon, a first-place award from her freshman year. The stark contrast between the Julia Carter of then and now was palpable. She felt a sense of mourning for the girl who saw the world in bold, unflinching strokes of colour and promise. As the sun crept higher, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold, Grace knocked softly on Julia Carter's door. She found Julia Carter surrounded by crumpled drafts of advocacy speeches and unsent letters to the board. With a gentle firmness, Grace shared her own story of dark days, of a time when she too felt the world closing in on her. It was a tale not of heroic triumphs, but of quiet, steadfast endurance, a story of picking up the pieces and finding a new way to stand. Heartened by Grace's words and bolstered by the knowledge that she was not alone, Julia Carter made her way to the health centre. There, in the sterile comfort of the ultrasound room, she met her daughter, a flickering heartbeat on the monitor, a tiny presence that was both part of her and wholly separate. Julia Carter's eyes were wet with a complex brew of love, grief and resolve as she spoke to the life within her. "I'm doing this for you," she whispered, "for your future." That night, Julia Carter wrote in her journal not plans or speeches, but a letter to her unborn daughter. In it, she poured all her hopes, her fears, and the love she held. It was an acknowledgement of the life she would soon bring into the world, and a vow to give her all the opportunities she deserved, opportunities that Julia Carter herself was still fighting for. The journal closed with a sense of peace, as Julia Carter, for the first time in a long while, drifted into a restful sleep. Julia Carter sat in the sterile ambience of the hospital's private room, the adoption papers spread before her on a cold metal table. The pen in her hand felt heavy, loaded with the weight of permanence. Her mind raced with the magnitude of the decision. As she traced her name on the dotted line, each stroke was a bittersweet farewell and a hopeful beginning. In the quiet sanctuary of the hospital chapel, Julia Carter met with Michael and Sarah. Their eyes, brimming with a mix of nervousness and excitement, met hers with gratitude and understanding. As they spoke of future Christmases, first steps and family traditions, Julia Carter saw the life her daughter would have. The conversation wasn't just an exchange of promises, but an intertwining of trust and shared dreams. The day of her final project exhibition arrived, and Julia Carter unveiled her work. The series was a chronicle of her journey, an array of canvases that spoke of turmoil, hope, and the bittersweet act of letting go. As attendees lingered before each piece, Julia Carter's story unfolded silently, eliciting nods of empathy and quiet words of praise. Her professors commended her depth, her peers saw her in a new light, and Julia Carter herself felt the catharsis of shared understanding. That night, after the lights dimmed and the last guest had departed, Julia Carter stood alone in the gallery. The silence was a stark contrast to the storm of emotions that had raged within her for months. Now, amidst her art, she felt a sense of closure. Her decision to place her daughter with Michael and Sarah was made real and right, not just in the ink of her signature, but in the acceptance in her heart. Julia Carter left the gallery with her portfolio under her arm, a tangible representation of her growth, her pain, and her unyielding strength. The art show had ended, but for Julia Carter, it marked the beginning of something profound. She stood before the mural of Paris in her dorm room, the city's lights no longer symbols of forsaken dreams, but beacons of the future she was forging. Her brushes, once idle, now danced across the canvas with renewed purpose, each stroke a testament to her journey. In the quiet of her room, Julia Carter opened her laptop to compose an email to Michael and Sarah. Attached were pictures of her artwork, each piece a chapter of the story that had brought them all together. Their reply came quickly, full of warmth and photos of her daughter, who was growing in a home filled with love and laughter. Julia Carter smiled at the images, a sense of peace washing over her. She had given her daughter a life full of potential, and in return, she had been gifted with a wellspring of inspiration. Graduation day arrived with pomp and circumstance. Julia Carter walked across the stage, her name called out with distinction. As she accepted her diploma, her gaze found grace in the crowd, her unwavering support a guiding star in her darkest times. Julia Carter's walk was a procession of pride, not just for the academic accolades, but for the resilience she had discovered within herself. Later, standing alone for a moment, diploma in hand, Julia Carter allowed herself to reflect. The uncertainty that once clouded her vision had dissipated, leaving clarity and a sense of purpose. She was not the naive girl who had once gazed upon the Paris mural with longing. She was a woman who had faced the tempest and emerged whole. Her story, like her art, would continue to evolve, a never-ending canvas of experiences and dreams. With a deep breath, Julia Carter stepped forward into her future, ready for whatever lay ahead.